Abigail Carter slammed both hands on the bar and screamed her uncle's name loud enough to stop every man in the Black Dog cold. She didn't care who heard. She didn't care who watched. The money had already changed hands, $50 folded and gone, and the man who raised her after her parents died was already backing toward the door without meeting her eyes. That was the moment she understood that no one in that room was going to help her. If you've ever been left behind by someone who was supposed to love you, stay with this story, subscribe to the channel, follow along until the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to 1881, to a Dakota Territory winter, and to a girl who had nothing left but her own 2 hands and a fury she didn't yet know how to use. The debt wasn't hers. That was the thing Abigail kept turning over in her mind, as Harold Pruitt, her mother's brother, the only family she had left in the world, counted out what he owed to the men at the corner table. She had come to Harding Creek with him 6 weeks ago because he said there was work. Bookkeeping work, honest work, the kind that paid enough to keep them both through the winter. She had believed him because she was 18 years old and had no reason yet not to believe the people who said they loved her. She understood now what kind of fool that made her. Harold. Her voice was quiet. That was worse than shouting, and she knew it. Harold, look at me. He didn't. The men at the corner table were watching him the way wolves watch something that's already fallen. 3 of them broad and dirty and smelling of cheap tobacco, with the particular patience of men who had done this kind of business before and expected no complications. The one in the middle, older with a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed since summer, had a leather ledger open on the table in front of him. He was running a finger down a column of numbers with the slow satisfaction of a man who already knew how the arithmetic came out. $240, the gray-bearded man said. That's what your uncle owes Miss, give or take. I am not part of this conversation, Abigail said. You are now. He didn't look up from the ledger. Harold here don't have $240. Harold here don't have 20. What Harold does have, he paused to turn the page, is a niece of working age with no legal ties to this county, no property, and no husband to make things complicated. Abigail looked at Harold, then really looked at him, searching for something, shame at least, or the beginning of a protest, and found nothing. His eyes were fixed on the floor. His hands were shaking, but not from anger, from relief. He was relieved. He had already made this decision before they walked through the door, and the shaking was the shaking of a man who had been carrying a secret and was finally putting it down. You told them about me, she said. Before we got here, you told them I'd come. He said nothing. Harold. I'm sorry, Abby. His voice cracked on her name. I didn't have any other. Don't. She stepped back from him. One step, then another, until the bar was solid against her spine. Don't you say you didn't have a choice. Don't you dare say that to me. The saloon had gone quiet in the particular way of a room where everyone has decided to mind their own business while watching every detail. The barman had found something urgent to do with a rag and a glass. The men playing cards near the window had not turned their heads, but their hands had gone still. Only the fire in the corner stove was indifferent, crackling on without apology. $50, the gray-bearded man said. He was speaking to someone behind Abigail now. She hadn't heard the door open. That's what I'm offering. She's young, able-bodied, not bad to look at, clean, your kind of arrangement. Abigail turned. The man standing just inside the door was the largest human being she had ever seen in her life. He wasn't performing it the way some big men do. Shoulders thrown back, chest forward, weight on both heels, like they're daring the room to challenge them. He was simply standing there, still as a post, with his hat in one hand and snow on both shoulders, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have spent a great deal of time alone in places where noise gets you killed. He was somewhere between 30 and 40, weathered past any easy guessing, with a jaw that had been broken and healed at an angle, and hands so large and scarred they looked like they belonged on a different order of creature. He was looking at her. Not the way the men at the corner table were looking at her, assessing, calculating, adding her up like a number in a column. He was looking at her the way you look at something you haven't decided about yet. Careful. Quiet. $50 is robbery, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that carries without effort, because the speaker has never felt the need to rush. But I'll pay it. Abigail's hand slammed down on the bar before she had made a decision to move. No. The word came out of her like something thrown. No. I am a person. Do you understand? I am a person, not a debt. Not a transaction. You cannot pay $50 and believe you have purchased a human being. The gray-bearded man was smiling. Harold had found the floor again. The big man by the door looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the man with the ledger. Does she come with any documents? He asked. Anything legal tying her to these men or this debt? Not as such, the man said. Harold's word that she's his too. Then there's no legal transaction here. He said it flat without heat like he was reading from a statute. You're describing coercion, which means the $50 I'm about to put on that table isn't payment for her. It's payment for your silence and your absence and the understanding that if I see any of you near Harding Creek again before spring the conversation we have, next time won't be the talking kind. Nobody said anything. He set the money on the table by the door, folded exact. Then he looked at Abigail. I'm not buying you, he said. I'm buying your way out of this room. What you do after that is your own business. She stared at him. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. And if I walk out that door, she said, where exactly do I walk to? He considered this. That's a fair question, he said. It's December, she said. It is December in Dakota Territory, and I have $3.40, and I do not know a single soul in this county. And my uncle... She stopped. Her voice had started to shake. She would not let it shake. My uncle has just sold me for $50 in a saloon, so if you're asking me to be grateful for this exit you've purchased, I would like to know what comes after. I've got a cabin, he said, up in the Bitterroot, a day's ride north. You'd have your own room, your own space. He paused. I'm not offering charity. I've got needs someone to keep the fire, manage the cooking help with the work that needs 2 sets of hands come winter. I'd pay you for it. Proper wages, not a gift. You'd pay me, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. After just spending $50 to remove me from this situation. I reckon I would. Abigail looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Harold, who was still staring at the floor. Then she looked at the 3 men at the corner table who were watching this exchange with the baffled expressions of men whose simple transaction had become unexpectedly complicated. Then she picked up her coat from the bar and walked toward the door. I am not, she said very clearly as she passed the big man property. No, ma'am, he said. You are not. His name was Cole Mercer, and he said almost nothing for the first 4 hours. She had expected questions, the practical kind. Who are you? Where are you from? What can you do? Or worse, the other kind. The kind that came wrapped in a different sort of transaction than the one she'd just escaped. She had prepared herself for both. She had her $3 folded inside her left boot, and she knew how to use her elbows, and she had decided in the doorway of the Black Dog that she would not survive 18 years of her life to be undone by a man who smelled like pine sap and wood smoke, however large he happened to be. But Cole Mercer didn't ask questions. He rode slightly ahead of her on the trail, close enough that she was always within eyesight, far enough that she had room to breathe. And he spoke exactly twice in the first hour. Once to tell her the trail forked left at the dead elm, and once to ask if she was warm enough. And when she said yes without looking at him, he nodded and said nothing more. The cold was absolute. It pressed in from every side and turned her exhaled breath to brief white clouds that vanished immediately in the wind off the high ridges. The horse she rode, a brown mare with a patient disposition, moved steadily on the packed snow of the trail without slipping. And Abigail kept her hands on the reins and her eyes forward and tried to take inventory of what she knew. She knew she was headed north into the Bitterroot Range with a man whose name she'd learned from the gray-bearded man's ledger entry, not from any introduction. She knew he was known in Harding Creek. The room had reacted to his presence, the way rooms react to weather, that particular collective stillness that comes over people when something powerful enters a space and they haven't decided yet whether it's going to hurt them. She knew he had paid $50 without hesitation, then immediately reframed it as something other than a purchase, and she didn't know yet what to do with that. She knew he hadn't looked at her the way the men at the corner table had looked at her. That last thing was the one she kept returning to, and it made her more uncomfortable than any of the others. Around the second hour, the trail climbed, and the trees closed in, and the wind dropped to almost nothing inside the timber. Cole pulled his horse to a stop at a creek crossing and dismounted to check the ice moving across it with careful deliberation, testing the edges with one boot before committing his weight. "It'll hold," he said. "Cross slow. Let the horse pick her path." Abigail crossed slow. The mare picked her path. The ice held. On the other side, Cole remounted without comment. And they went on, and Abigail found herself watching the way he moved, not with the studied carelessness of a man performing his own capability, but with the genuine economy of someone for whom the wilderness was not a backdrop, but a fact. He watched the tree line. He read the snow. When a branch dropped its load of white 50 yards to their left, he turned his head toward it without alarm, assessed it in 1 second, and looked away. No drama, just attention. "How long have you been on the mountain?" she asked. He glanced back at her just briefly. 11 years. Alone. Mostly. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "The men in that saloon," she said. "They knew your name." "Most people in this county know my name." "They were afraid of you." He was quiet for a moment. "That's their business." "Are they right to be—" Another pause. Longer this time. She had the feeling he was choosing his words with care, not because he was hiding something, but because he didn't consider speech disposable. Every word meant to carry weight, and if it didn't, better left unsaid. "I've never heard a person who didn't come at me first," he said finally. "That's not quite an answer to the question." "No," he said. "It ain't." The cabin appeared out of the tree line just before dusk, low and broad, and built from timber that had been standing long enough to gray at the edges, with a stone chimney and a covered porch, and the look of a structure that had been added to over years by hands that knew what they were doing. A lean-to for the horses ran along the east side. A woodpile enormous, stacked higher than the porch rail, occupied most of the north wall. Cole unsaddled both horses in practiced silence while Abigail stood on the porch and tried to decide what to be afraid of. "Inside," he said not unkindly when he'd finished. "Get the fire going. Wood's by the door." She went inside. The cabin was one large main room with a stone hearth, a table, 2 chairs, a workbench along one wall, and a curtained-off area at the back that she correctly identified as sleeping quarters. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, and something else she couldn't name, the particular smell of a space inhabited by a single person for a very long time, not unpleasant, just solitary. She found the wood. She built the fire. She had grown up in Nebraska before her parents died, and her father had believed in teaching his children things that were useful, and building a fire in a cold hearth was useful. When Cole came in, the fire was going, and she was standing at the window, watching the last of the light die over the western ridge. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the fire for a moment, then at her. "You know how to do that," he said. It wasn't a question. "My father taught me." He nodded. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. He went to the workbench and began to deal with something she couldn't see from where she stood. "The curtained room," she said. "Is that where you sleep?" "Used to be." "And now?" He picked up a chair from beside the workbench and set it facing the hearth and sat down in it with the careful deliberateness of a man negotiating a sore back. "I'll sleep out here." She turned from the window. "That's your bed." "Yes, ma'am." "I am not going to take your bed." "Then we'll both sleep out here," he said, "and neither of us will be particularly comfortable, but that's a fair arrangement." He reached for a piece of leather on the workbench and began working it with a folding knife, doing something small and precise that seemed to require most of his attention. "Or you can take the room, your choice. I'm not going to argue about it." Abigail stared at the back of his head. The firelight moved across his shoulders, and she watched the way the knife moved, small and careful, and thought about what it meant that a man this size with hands that scarred was choosing to talk to her about sleeping arrangements, instead of simply pointing at the floor and calling that his answer. "Why did you do it?" she said. He didn't look up from the leather. "Do what?" "The $50, that saloon, any of it." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, and she had almost turned back to the window when he said, "I go into Harding Creek twice a year, spring and fall, to trade, pick up supplies." He paused. "I've seen that saloon do that kind of business before. And I don't like it." "So you paid $50? I had $50. He turned the leather over in his hands. "And I needed someone with a head for numbers. I've been running my trapping accounts in my head for 11 years, and I'm not bad at it, but I know I'm not good at it either, and I lose money every year at the trading post because I can't read their ledgers fast enough to catch what they're doing." He glanced back at her, then, just briefly, "Harold said you were a bookkeeper." She blinked. "You talked to Harold before you walked into that saloon, outside of it. He was looking for someone to make the arrangement easier. I told him to go to the devil, and I went inside and bought your way out instead." He paused. "The bookkeeping offer is real. If you've got the skill, I need it. If you decide to leave in the spring, I'll get you to the stage in Harding Creek and pay your fare to wherever you're going." He set down the leather and looked at her, fully turning in the chair. "I'm not looking for gratitude. I'm not looking for anything you don't freely offer. I want that to be clear." Abigail held his gaze. She was waiting for the lie in it. She had learned by now that men who spoke in the language of fairness usually had the ledger tilted their direction before the conversation started. She was 18, and she was not naive, and she had grown up watching her father do business with men who smiled while they shook hands and added a column later that hadn't been discussed. Cole Mercer's face was not the face of a man who smiled easily. It was not the face of a man performing anything. It was the face of someone saying exactly what he meant, with the particular weariness of someone who had long ago stopped seeing any point in saying otherwise. "I want my own room," she said. "Done. And I want it understood that the work I do is paid work, not obligation, not debt to a transaction that I didn't agree to." "Agreed. And if you ever—" She stopped, started again. "If you ever make me feel the way those men made me feel tonight, I will leave. Weather or no weather. I will walk off this mountain before I spend one more minute." "You won't have to walk," he said quietly. "If I ever make you feel that way, you'll have the mare and a head start, and I won't come after you." He held her gaze without blinking. "That's a promise, Miss Carter." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind had started moving through the timber, and it made the low, ongoing sound of a wilderness that did not particularly notice the presence of human beings, and was not adjusting itself on their account. Abigail stood in the center of the room that was not hers yet, and looked at the man who had paid $50 for a transaction she wanted no part of, and understood that she had arrived at a place she had no map for. She had spent the ride north preparing for cruelty, and cruelty had not arrived. She had prepared for force, and force had not arrived. What had arrived was a chair by a fire, a fair exchange spoken in plain language, and a promise delivered without theater or sentiment, by a man who did not seem to understand that men like him were not supposed to behave this way. She didn't know what to do with that. She took the room. She lay down on the bed without undressing, with her boots still on, and her $3 still in the left one, and she listened to Cole Mercer settle himself in the chair by the fire in the main room, and she waited for something to go wrong. Nothing went wrong. By the time the fire burned low and the cabin went quiet, she was still waiting. And somewhere in the waiting, without meaning to, she fell asleep. She woke up before dawn with her hand on her boot, not because she'd heard anything, not because Cole Mercer had moved from his chair or made a sound she could point to. She woke up because 18 years of being the lightest sleeper in whatever house she occupied had trained her body to read silence, the way other people read print, and the silence in the cabin that morning had changed texture. Somewhere in the dark hours, thickened, settled, gone completely still, and her body registered that change before her mind caught up. She lay still for a moment, listened. The fire had burned down to coals. She could hear the wind outside working through the timber with a low, sustained patience that suggested it had been at this for hours and intended to continue. She could hear nothing from the main room. She got up, put her feet on the floor, and went to the curtain. Cole was asleep in the chair. Not slumped, sitting upright with his arms folded across his chest and his chin dropped forward the way soldiers sleep, or men who have learned that deep sleep is a luxury the wilderness doesn't reliably offer. His breathing was slow and even. The fire beside him had gone nearly cold. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she went and built the fire back up herself. She didn't know why she did it. She had told herself on the ride north that she would perform whatever labor was agreed to, and nothing beyond it, that she would be competent and distant and give no more than was bargained for, because that was how you survived an arrangement you hadn't chosen. Extra effort was the first step toward debt, and she knew that debt, the invisible kind, was the most dangerous kind there was. But the fire was nearly dead, and the cabin was cold, and Cole Mercer was sitting upright in a chair in his own home because he had given his bed to a stranger, and she built the fire back up because she was not, regardless of what the last 24 hours had suggested, the kind of person who watched a fire go cold when she had the means to fix it. She had the kindling going, and the larger logs arranged before he stirred. "You don't have to do that," he said. His voice was rougher with sleep, but not startled. He'd probably been half awake for the last 5 minutes, she realized, just watching. "I know," she said. She didn't look at him. "I'm doing it anyway." He was quiet. Then he unfolded himself from the chair with the careful movements of a man whose back had lodged a formal complaint, and she heard him moving across the room behind her, the sound of a coat being taken from a hook, boots being pulled on. "I'll see to the horses," he said. "There's no coffee," she said. "I looked last night. You have dried beans and what I believe is hardtack and something in a tin that I wasn't brave enough to open." "Trading Post has coffee," he said. "I'll get some next trip." "When is that?" "February, most likely." She finally looked at him. He was already at the door, hat and hand coat on. The morning light coming through the single east-facing window was the particular gray of Dakota Territory in December, the kind of light that gives no warmth and no promises. "February," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "It is currently December." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the fire. "Then I'll figure out the tin." He made a sound that might under other circumstances have been the beginning of a laugh. Then the door opened and closed, and she was alone in the cabin with the growing fire and whatever was in the tin, and the strange, disorienting sensation of a morning that was not so far what she had prepared herself for. The tin had salt pork in it. Abigail found cornmeal in a cloth sack behind the beans, and she made what her mother would have generously called a Johnny cake, and what she herself would have called an act of stubbornness, because she had only a fire and a cast-iron pan, and no eggs, and no milk, and no fat, besides the salt pork drippings, and she made it work through sheer refusal to accept that it wouldn't. Cole came back from the lean-to with snow on his shoulders and stopped just inside the door at the smell of it. He didn't say anything. He sat down at the table, and she put the pan in the center of it, and they ate standing and sitting respectively, and he consumed 3 portions of something that was barely food, and said when he was done, "That's better than anything I've made in 6 months." "That's a damning statement," she said. "I'm aware." He pushed back from the table. "I'm not a cook." "What are you?" He thought about this with the seriousness of someone who doesn't give automatic answers to questions that deserve real ones. "A trapper," he said. "A fair shot, a decent hand with timber." He paused. "A poor businessman, apparently." "Tell me about the Trading Post," she said. He looked up. "You said you lose money every year because you can't read their ledgers fast enough. Tell me what you trade, what you get, and what you think you're losing." He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, she was beginning to understand, just methodical. processing the question like a man who had lived alone long enough that he experienced conversation as something that required a certain amount of internal assembly before it could be delivered. "Beaver mostly," he said. "Some mink. Last fall I brought in 42 pelts good quality, and Harlan at the post paid me 60 cents on a dollar. Said the market was soft." "Was it?" "I don't know. That's the problem. He shows me a paper with prices on it, and by the time I've read it through, he's already explaining why my lot in particular doesn't qualify for the top rate. I lose the thread of it." "Do you keep records? What you bring in, what you're paid?" "In my head." "Show me," she said. "All of it. Everything you remember, from the last 3 years." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between surprised and something slower and more careful than surprise. Like a man who had learned to hold himself back from wanting things, because wanting them made the eventual absence worse. "You really do know bookkeeping," he said. "My father was a dry goods merchant in Kearney, Nebraska. He taught me accounting before he taught me to read because he said numbers were more honest than words." She folded her hands on the table. "I kept his books from the time I was 12 until he died. I know what a ledger manipulation looks like, and I know how to read the kind of paper Harlan showed you in about 45 seconds. She held Cole's gaze. "You're not a poor businessman. You're an honest man doing business with a dishonest one, and you don't have the tools to catch him at it. That's a different problem." Cole was very still. "That's a different problem," he repeated slowly, like he was turning it over. "Yes." He got up from the table and went to the workbench and opened a drawer she hadn't noticed before, and he came back with a folded piece of paper that was so creased and worn at the folds it had gone soft. He set it in front of her. It was a receipt from the Harding Creek Trading Post. September 1880. 42 pelts, various grades total, paid $26.80. Abigail read it twice. "Cole," she said. "What?" "He paid you 63 cents a pelt." "That's what I said. 60 cents on the dollar." "No. He told you 60 cents on the dollar and paid you 63 cents a pelt. Those are not the same number, and he knew you wouldn't check the math while he was talking." She set the receipt down. If average beaver was running $1.15 in the fall of 1880, which I believe it was because my father was corresponding with a furrier in St. Louis at that time, and I read his letters, then 60 cents on the dollar should have been 69 cents per pelt. You were shorted 6 cents on 42 pelts. Cole looked at the receipt, then at her. "That's $2.52, he said. "Over one transaction. How many transactions have you had with Harlan in the last 11 years? She watched his face change as the arithmetic assembled itself behind his eyes, and she didn't need him to say the number out loud to understand that they were talking about something significant. "This is fixable," she said. "Not the past, but the future. I can build you a record-keeping system simple enough to maintain yourself if I'm not here, and I can write you a price guide based on the St. Louis market rates that you can carry in your coat pocket. When Harlan shows you his paper, you show him yours." Cole sat back down. He was looking at her with that same careful, unreadable expression, and this time she recognized what was in it. It was not calculation. It was not the look of a man reassessing the value of a purchase. It was the look of someone who had been alone for a very long time and had stopped expecting to be understood. She looked away first. "We'll need paper," she said. "And ink if you have it. If not, charcoal will do for the rough work." "I've got paper," he said. "And ink. Then we'll start this afternoon." They started that afternoon, and the afternoon became evening, and the evening became the first night that passed in the Mercer cabin without Abigail waiting for something to go wrong. She was not foolish enough to believe that this meant nothing would. The first real test came 4 days in, and it came in the form of a skinned rabbit. Cole had gone out at first light. She was learning his rhythms, the way the cabin emptied before dawn and filled again by mid-morning. The sounds that meant he was in the lean-to versus the sounds that meant he was farther out on the trap line. She had developed the habit of listening for those sounds without intending to, the way you learn the schedule of something you're trying not to be dependent on. He came back and set a dressed rabbit on the table without preamble, along with a burlap sack that turned out to contain 3 small potatoes and a turnip. "Where did you get potatoes?" she said. "Root cellar. Forgot to mention it." She stared at him. "You have a root cellar?" "Behind the lean-to. There's dried apples, too, and some hard cheese wrapped in cloth. Should be good still." He said this with the complete tranquility of a man who genuinely had not thought to mention it before. "Cole." She kept her voice very even. "We have been eating Johnny cakes and salt pork for 4 days. The Johnny cakes were good. That is entirely beside the point." He considered this. "I'm not used to having someone to tell things to," he said, not as an apology, just as a statement of fact. "I know where everything is. It didn't occur to me that you didn't." Abigail put her hands flat on the table and took one deliberate breath. Then she picked up the rabbit and the potatoes and the turnip, and she made a stew, and while it cooked, Cole walked her to the root cellar and showed her everything that was in it. And she made him stand there while she mentally cataloged the inventory, and somewhere in the middle of this deeply practical activity, she realized that she had stopped being afraid of him. Not because he had done anything dramatic to earn her trust. Not because there had been a moment of declaration or revelation or any of the things that were supposed to happen in stories when a woman stopped being afraid of a man. She had stopped being afraid of him the way you stop being afraid of weather. You've lived through, not because it had been gentle, but because you had measured it and found it consistent. He was what he was. He did not change based on her observation of him, and in her experience that was rarer than most people understood. "The cheese is on the left," he said, "behind the apples." "I see it." "There's a second sack of cornmeal I put up in October. The first one you found is better quality, but the second one is fine for every day." "All right. And there's dried venison hanging in the far corner. I put it up myself. It's harder than you'd like, but it reconstitutes in the stew." She looked at the dried venison. She looked at Cole. "How much else is there that you haven't told me?" He had the grace to look, if not exactly ashamed, then at least mildly aware of the problem. "Some." "Tonight," she said, "you are going to sit at that table and tell me everything. Every supply, every tool, every arrangement this place runs on. I cannot manage a household I can't see." "That's fair," he said. "It's practical," she corrected. "Not fair. Fair is a different conversation." He nodded slowly. "All right." That night, while the stew finished and the snow resumed outside and the fire did what fire does, Cole Mercer sat across from Abigail Carter and told her things. Not personal things, not yet. And she wasn't asking for them, but logistical things. The shape of the life he had built on this mountain over 11 years. The way the cabin worked, and the trapline ran, and the seasons changed the demands on both. She listened, and made notes on the paper he'd given her, and asked questions when the information was incomplete, and he answered all of them with the same methodical honesty that she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. He didn't embellish. He didn't deflect. He didn't tell her things to manage how she felt about them. He said what was true and stopped when he'd said it. She realized while watching him think through her question about the spring planting, met a man who talked that way. Her father had been kind, but he'd been a storyteller. Everything improved in the telling corners, rounded difficulties smoothed. Harold had been a liar in the way of men who tell the truth so rarely that they've forgotten how to recognize it. The men her father had done business with were performers, all of them putting on the face that served the moment. Cole Mercer didn't seem to own a face for any purpose other than whatever was actually happening. "You don't talk much," she said when they'd been going for a while, and he'd fallen into a natural pause. "No, ma'am." "Is that how you prefer it, or is that how you've gotten—" He thought about this. The fire moved. The wind made its steady sound against the walls. "I used to talk more," he said finally. "When there was someone to talk to." She looked at him. He was looking at his hands. There was something in that sentence, not a complaint, just a statement, the kind of statement that contains an entire history in very few words, and she felt it land in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. "Well," she said, "there is now." He looked up at her. She looked back down at her notes. The second test came in the second week, and it was harder than the rabbit. She had asked to see the trap line. Cole had looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he's been asked about that he hasn't considered from the outside in a very long time. Not refusing, just recalibrating. "It's a long walk," he said. "I know it's a long walk," she said. "I need to understand the full operation if I'm going to build you an accurate accounting system. The trapline is half the income. I need to see what it is." He had taken her out the next morning, and she had discovered that a long walk in Dakota Territory in December was a specific kind of suffering that no amount of preparation fully prepared you for. But she didn't say so. She followed his path through the snow and watched where he put his feet and put her feet in the same places, and she paid attention. What she noticed watching him work the line was not what she'd expected to notice. She'd expected competence. She already knew he was competent. What she hadn't expected was the care. The way he reset a trigger that hadn't fired with the same attention he'd have given a successful trap. The way he read the snow around each set. The way she read a ledger column looking for what was off, what didn't add up. What the numbers were actually saying, as opposed to what they appeared to say at first glance. "You're reading the animal," she said, watching him crouch beside a set near a creek bend. "Yes, ma'am." "The way I read a column of figures, looking for pattern." He looked up at her. "I suppose so," he said. "Never thought of it that way." "What are you seeing here?" He considered whether to answer. She was learning that this pause, this particular pause, shorter than his thinking pause and longer than his "I don't want to answer" pause, meant he was deciding whether a thing was worth the words. More often than not, he decided it was. "Beaver's been here twice in the last 3 days," he said. "Both times he came from the west and left going north. Means the lodge is north of here, which I didn't know. I've been setting here because it looked like a natural crossing, but I'd do better 20 yards north and a foot to the right of the current run." "So you move it?" "I move it." He did with the economic precision of someone who had done this so many times that thought and action had fused into a single motion. They walked the line for 4 hours. By the end of it, Abigail's feet had stopped feeling like feet and started feeling like suggestions. But she had a complete accounting in her notebook of every set, the approximate yield of each in a normal season. The variables that affected that yield, and 3 specific patterns she'd noticed in Cole's own records, the ones he kept in his head, that suggested he was consistently underreporting his expected take to himself as a kind of protection against disappointment. "You lowball your own projections," she said when they were an hour from the cabin on the return. "What? When you estimate a season's take, you estimate low, consistently. I can tell from the way you talk about it, you say 30 pelts maybe, when you mean 30 pelts likely 40. It's a habit." He was quiet. "Where'd you learn it?" she said. The pause this time was longer than all the others. "My father," he said finally. He'd get excited about a thing and plan around it, and when it didn't come through the way he'd planned it, he stopped, started again. It was hard on him, hard on all of us. I learned early not to plan on things being as good as they might be. Abigail walked beside him in the snow. The trees were close on both sides, and the sky above the trail was the specific, hard gray of late afternoon in December, and she thought about fathers who taught their children to protect themselves from their own hope. "That's a sad way to run an accounting," she said. "I reckon it is. It also means you've been underplanning your supply runs for 11 years. If you consistently expect less than you get, you consistently prepare for less than you need, and that's how you end up with no coffee in February." He made the sound that was the beginning of a laugh, more than before. "That's probably right," he said. "I'm going to build you a system that doesn't do that," she said. "Realistic projections, not optimistic, not pessimistic, just accurate. You think you can do that? I know I can." He glanced at her sideways, a brief look, then away, and she caught something in it that she filed away without examining too closely. Not the look of a man assessing property, Not the look of a man calculating advantage. The look of someone surprised to be believed in. They were nearly back at the cabin when the sound came. Not the wind, not the timber settling, not any of the ordinary sounds she had learned to sort in the 2 weeks she'd been on the mountain. This was the specific sound of something heavy moving through snow with direction and purpose, and Cole stopped so fast she walked into his shoulder before she knew he'd stopped. His hand came up, not grabbing her, just rising between them, the universal gesture for be still, and she was still. They listened. The sound stopped. Then a man's voice came through the trees, maybe 40 yards east, calling out with the particular volume of someone who wants to be heard as non-threatening and isn't quite managing it. "Hello, the cabin. Looking for Cole Mercer." Cole's expression didn't change. He put his hand down and called back, "Who's asking?" A pause. Then, "Name's Dylan Reese. I ride for the gantry outfit down in the valley. Got a message for you from my boss." Cole turned to look at Abigail. She looked back at him. "You know him," she said low. "I know the gantry outfit," he said in a tone that told her nothing and everything simultaneously. He called out, "Come ahead, slow." The man who came through the trees was young, younger than she'd expected, from the voice with a red scarf around his neck and snow on his hat brim, and the fidgety, over-careful posture of someone who has been told exactly how important this errand is and is terrified of getting it wrong. He was not armed, or if he was making no display of it. He stopped when he saw Abigail, and the fidgety look intensified. "Didn't know you had company," he said to Cole. "What does Gantry want?" Cole said. The young man reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "He wants to buy your trap line," he said. "North Quarter East Ridge Creek section, all of it. He's offering fair price." He held out the envelope. "Numbers are in there." Cole didn't take it. "I'm not selling," he said. "Mr. Gantry said to ask you to think about it." "I thought about it." Cole nodded at the envelope. "Take that back to him. The young man. Dylan Reese." Abigail reminded herself, giving him the dignity of his name in her own mind, looked at the envelope, and then at Cole, and then briefly at Abigail. "Ma'am?" he said with something that might have been an apology for the whole situation. "Mr. Reese," she said. He turned and went back through the trees the way he'd come. They listened to his footsteps diminish in the snow until the timber swallowed the sound. Cole stood looking at the space where the man had been. "What does Gantry want with your trap line?" Abigail said. "What they always want," he said. "More." He turned and walked toward the cabin. It's not the first time he sent someone. She followed him. And the other times, same answer. What happens when the same answer stops working? He pulled the cabin door open and held it. She went inside. He came in after and closed it and stood by the door for a moment, looking at nothing in particular with the quality of a man running something through his mind that he'd run through many times before and had still not arrived at a satisfying conclusion. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I expect we'll find out." The word "we" sat in the middle of the room between them, unacknowledged by either of them. Abigail went to the fire. Cole went to the workbench. And outside, Dylan Reese rode back down the mountain with an unopened envelope and a message that his employer was not going to like, and the day moved toward dark, with the particular indifference of a wilderness that has seen men want things from each other and knows exactly how those stories tend to end. That night she woke again, at the same hour as before, the deep false midnight of a winter without moonlight. And she lay still for a moment and ran through the inventory of sounds in the cabin. Cole's breathing even and present from the chair by the fire. Wind. Snow ticking against the north wall. The low, sustained voice of the mountain doing what it always did. And underneath all of it, something new. Something she hadn't woken up listening for, and found herself listening for anyway. She was listening for whether he was still there. She closed her eyes. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was the instinct of someone in a vulnerable position, making sure the variables hadn't changed in the night. She told herself a great many things lying in the dark in a dead man's she'd learned from Cole that the cabin's previous owner had died 2 winters ago, and left it untended bed on a mountain in Dakota Territory, with her $3 still in her boot, and the ember smell of the fire coming through the curtain. And underneath all the things she told herself, one simple fact: the chair had not moved, the breathing had not stopped, and something in her chest, small and unasked for, and not at all ready to be named, had gone quiet in response. She lay there in the dark and listened to Cole Mercer breathe, and understood for the first time, and with the certainty of the kind of knowledge that can't be unfound, that she was in a great deal of trouble. Not the kind she'd been afraid of since the black dog. A different kind entirely. She didn't tell him what she'd realized in the dark. She was smarter than that. She got up the next morning before he stirred, built the fire. The same way she'd been building it, made the same Johnny cakes with the same cast iron pan, and sat across from him at the same table while he ate, with the same quiet economy he brought to everything. And she gave no indication whatsoever that the previous night had happened, the way it had happened inside her chest. Cole, for his part, gave no indication either. He ate. He told her the weather was going to change by afternoon. She'd learned he read weather the way she read ledgers, with a precision that looked like instinct, but was actually accumulated knowledge. And he said he wanted to move 2 more sets on the East Ridge before the temperature dropped again. He asked if she needed anything from the supply shed. She said no. He nodded and put on his coat and went out. Abigail sat at the table with her coffee she had found behind the dried apples in the root cellar, a small cache of grounds that Cole had apparently forgotten entirely, which told her something useful about his relationship with his own inventory, and looked at the paper in front of her. The accounting system she was building him was nearly done. 2 weeks of work organized around the trapline map she'd drawn from memory after walking it with him, with columns for projected yield, actual yield market rate, and what Harlan at the trading post paid versus what he should have paid. She had built it so that Cole could maintain it himself with nothing more than a pencil and the price guide she'd written out separately on a piece of card she'd hardened over the fire. It was good work. She knew it was good work. And knowing it was good work meant acknowledging that once it was finished, the specific purpose that had justified her presence here was complete. She turned that thought over very carefully. The way you handle something you suspect might be sharper than it looks. She had $3 in her boot. She had the promise of a stage fare to wherever she was going. She realized with the particular clarity of a cold morning and honest coffee, absolutely no idea where she was going. Kearney was gone. Her father's house sold to pay his debts. The business closed. Everything that had been home dismantled before she and Harold had left Nebraska. She had no friends in Dakota Territory, and no family she trusted. She was 18 years old, and had spent 2 weeks on a mountain with a man who slept in a chair, so she could have his bed, and she was sitting here at his table, building him an accounting system she had not been asked for and had decided on herself. And she had woken up in the night, listening for his breathing. She pressed her hands flat on the table. This was the kind of thinking that got women into trouble. Not the obvious kind of trouble. She'd been ahead of that particular danger since the black dog and Cole Mercer had given her no cause to revise that assessment. The other kind. The kind where you were so relieved not to be afraid that you mistook relief for something else, and built a story on top of it that the facts didn't support, and woke up one morning having made a series of small choices that added up to a large consequence you hadn't intended. She was not going to do that. She picked up her pencil and went back to work. Cole came in at midday with snow on his hat and something wrapped in burlap that turned out to be a grouse he'd taken on the way back from the East Ridge. He set it on the table without ceremony and began unwrapping his outer layer by the door, and Abigail looked at the grouse and then looked at him. "You moved the sets," she said. "4 of them. Conditions were right." He hung his coat. "Wind shifted earlier than I expected." "I thought you said afternoon." "I was wrong." He said it without any apparent distress about being wrong, which she'd noticed before. He had no particular investment in being right, only in being accurate. When the two diverged, he updated without drama. "I finished the price guide," she said. He came to the table and looked at the card. He picked it up. He read it slowly because she'd noticed he read slowly and deliberately rather than quickly processing each piece of information fully before moving to the next. And when he was done, he set it down and looked at her with that expression she still couldn't fully categorize. "This is complete," he said. "Yes?" "You put the seasonal variation in. Fur prices move with the season and the weather and what's happening in the eastern markets. A static number is worse than useless. It'll make you overconfident in bad years and underprepared in good ones. The ranges I've given you account for the realistic spread." She tapped the card. "You read across for the animal down for the month, and the intersection gives you the floor and ceiling. If Harlan quotes you below the floor, you know he's cheating you. If he quotes you above the ceiling, he's either had a windfall or he wants something from you." Cole looked at the card again, then at her. "How long did this take you?" 3 days of the accounting, 1 day for the card." "Abigail." He said her name with the same deliberateness he brought to everything without decoration or diminishment. Just the word, weighted correctly. "This is worth more than I paid Harold for you." The sentence landed badly, and he saw it land badly, and his expression shifted not with alarm, but with the particular careful attention of a man who has said something that required immediate repair. "That came out wrong," he said. "It did," she agreed. "I meant," he stopped. Tried again. "I meant that the work is valuable. What you've built here, it's not what I expected when I—" He stopped again. "When you paid $50, she said. "When I got you out of that saloon." He held her gaze. "I didn't pay Harold for you. I paid him to remove himself from a situation he had no right to profit from. There's a difference." "I know there is." She looked down at the card. "I know the difference, Cole. I've known it for a while." She paused. "That doesn't mean the sentence didn't land the way it landed. No, it doesn't." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He folded his hands on the table, and she noticed not for the first time the way his hands looked, doing nothing, large and scarred and completely still, the hands of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary movement was just noise. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up. "What happens when the accounting's done?" The exact question she'd been asking herself 2 hours ago, sitting at this same table with her coffee. "I don't know yet," she said. "You could stay." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without preamble, looking at her. "The accounting's finished, but the trading post runs twice a year, and Harlan isn't the only one in this county who keeps crooked books. And the cabin runs better." He paused. "You run it better than I do." "I've been here 2 weeks. I know how long you've been here." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a reason to stay." "No," he said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to stay for my sake. I'm asking you to consider whether there's anything here worth staying for on your own account." The fire moved. The wind found the north wall and pressed against it and moved on. Abigail thought about Kearney, which was gone. She thought about the stage in Harding Creek, which would take her somewhere that was not here. She thought about the specific quality of the last 2 weeks, the particular texture of days that were difficult and cold and full of work, and not once, frightening. She thought about waking up in the night and listening for his breathing and the quiet that had moved through her chest when she found it. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He picked up the grouse and stood. "I'll clean this outside," he said. "Cole?" He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for asking instead of assuming." He looked at her steadily. "There's no other way to ask," he said, and went out. The snow came in that night, the way Cole had predicted, later than he'd thought, harder than he'd said, and by morning the world outside the cabin had reorganized itself around a new set of facts that made the trapline inaccessible and the trail to Harding Creek impassable, and the two of them, for all practical purposes, alone on a mountain in the specific way that has nothing to do with preference and everything to do with weather. Abigail stood at the window the next morning and looked at what the snow had made of the world and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not trapped. The opposite of trapped. Something she didn't have a word for yet. The sensation of being exactly as enclosed as you are, no more, no less, with nothing outside the walls making demands on you that you couldn't meet. Cole was at the workbench behind her, doing something with a trap mechanism that had frozen on the last run. She could hear the small, precise sounds of his work, the particular rhythm of someone who knows a task thoroughly enough to do it without looking. "Tell me about before," she said. The sounds stopped. "Before what?" he said. "Before the mountain. You said you used to talk more when there was someone to talk to." She didn't turn from the window. "Who were you talking to?" A long pause, longer than usual. "Wife," he said. Abigail turned. He was still looking at the trap mechanism in his hands. His expression was the specific neutral of someone holding something very carefully at arm's length. "She died," he said. 8 years ago. Fever. We'd been on the mountain 3 years when it happened." He turned the mechanism over. "She was the one who wanted to come up here. I thought she was out of her mind." A pause. "She was right as it turned out. She usually was." "What was her name?" "Clara." He said it without looking up, but something moved across his face when he said it. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more like the recognition of an absence so long-standing, it had become structural, built into the architecture of the life around it. "She would have liked you," he said. Abigail didn't say anything. "She was practical," he said. "No patience for men who couldn't think clearly. She'd have had that price guide done in a day and a half." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, gone as fast as it appeared. "She used to say I thought like a beaver. Patient and territorial and completely unwilling to change course once I'd decided on something." "She wasn't wrong," Abigail said. He looked up at her. "You're doing it right now," she said. "With Gantry's offer. You've decided, so it's decided. The question of whether it's the right decision doesn't appear to be open for review." "The decision is right," he said. "Is it, or have you decided it is?" He set down the trap mechanism. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being pushed back against and is discovering with some surprise that he doesn't mind it. "Tell me why it wouldn't be." "I didn't say it wouldn't be. I said you haven't reviewed it." She came to the table and sat down. "What does Gantry actually want?" "Not the trapline. What's underneath the trapline? What is he actually buying if you sell?" Cole was quiet. "Think about it the way you think about the trading post," she said. "Not what the paper says, what the numbers mean." He looked at his hands. She watched him work through it, the same process she'd seen him apply to the trapline, to the weather, to the trap mechanism, applying the same patient attention to this problem that he applied to all the others. "Water," he said finally. "Say more." "The north quarter of my trapline runs along Ridgeback Creek. It's the only reliable water source on the east face of the mountain in summer. The valley ranches are dry by August." He looked up. "If Gantry owns the creek access, he controls the water. And if he controls the water on the east face, every small rancher between here and Laramie is either buying from him or moving out." Abigail held his gaze. "So this isn't about your trapline?" "No. And his offering you a fair price isn't generosity." "No, it's—" He stopped. "It's the cheapest way to get what he actually wants. If I don't sell, he has to find another way, legal or otherwise." "And if it's otherwise—" The words sat there between them. Cole picked up the trap mechanism again and looked at it. "I've been watching Gantry for 3 years," he said. "He doesn't send messengers when he's asking. He sends messengers when he's telling you he's asking, which is different." He paused. "Dylan Reese coming up here wasn't an offer. It was a notification." Abigail's hands went still on the table. "You knew that when he came," she said. "I suspected it." "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't think—" He stopped. "You didn't think it was my business." She kept her voice level. "Because I haven't decided to stay yet. So why tell me something that might influence the decision in a direction that's complicated?" He looked at her. The expression on his face was not guilty exactly. It was the expression of a man who has been caught being protective by someone who does not need protecting and is sophisticated enough to understand the distinction. "Yes," he said simply. "Cole." She leaned forward slightly. If there are men who might come to this mountain looking for an answer you've already given them, I need to know that. Not because it affects whether I stay, because if I'm here when they come, I need to know what I'm walking into." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the gravity of a man making a genuine concession. "Gantry has 3 men that I know of who handle his problems that can't be handled through a messenger," he said. "One of them is his foreman name of Birch. The other 2 I don't know by name, but I've seen them in Harding Creek. They're not ranch hands." "What are they?" "Hired," he said. Abigail absorbed this. Outside, the snow was still coming down with the patient intensity of weather that has decided on a position and intends to hold it. The fire was good, and the cabin was warm, and none of that changed what Cole had just said. "How long do you think we have?" she said. The "we" came out without her intending it, and sat in the room the same way it had sat the last time. Unacknowledged present, changing the shape of the air around it. "Spring, maybe?" Cole said. "Gantry won't move men up the mountain in this weather. Too costly and too visible. But when the snow breaks—" He paused. "Then it becomes a different question." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right. All right, I understand the situation." She met his eyes. "And all right, I'm staying." Something moved across Cole Mercer's face, fast controlled, held back before it could fully arrive. But she saw it. She was watching carefully enough now to see it, and she saw it, and she filed it away with the same deliberateness she filed everything. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to." She kept her voice even. "That's the point, Cole. I don't have to. I'm choosing to." She paused. "Don't make it into something larger than it is. I'm choosing to stay through the winter. That's a practical decision about weather and available options. Nothing more." "Of course," he said. Neither of them entirely believed her. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Abigail Carter's life, and she had now lived through a sufficient volume of strange to have a meaningful basis for comparison. The snow held the mountain in its particular grip, and the grip meant that the days had a structure imposed by weather rather than choice. What needed doing was what could be done, and what could be done was mostly interior work, the work of a cabin in winter, which was relentless and physical and surprisingly companionable when you were doing it alongside someone who approached labor the same way you did. Cole chopped wood. Abigail managed the stores, tracked the inventory with the same system she'd built for his accounts, and began without being asked, without announcing that she was doing it to audit the trapping records he'd kept in his head over 11 years, reconstructing them from his memory, and cross-referencing against what he knew of market prices and seasonal yields. She found $4,000, not $4,000 he'd been paid. $4,000 he had not been paid. The accumulated shortfall of 11 years of Harlan's bookkeeping, spread across enough individual transactions that no single one looked egregious, and the total was invisible unless you did what Abigail did, which was add everything up from the beginning and follow where the numbers went. She sat very still with the paper in front of her for a long time after she finished the calculation. Then she called across the cabin, "Cole." He looked up from the axe handle he was refinishing. "Come look at this." He came and stood behind her and read the paper over her shoulder. She heard him take a breath in and hold it. She counted silently to herself and got to 7 before he let it out. $4,000, he said. $4,212. Give or take, because some of the early years are harder to reconstruct. She tapped the column. "This is what Harlan owes you. It's also a legal claim. A documented one now that I've built the records the way I have." "Harlan doesn't have $4,000. "No, but whoever owns the trading post license does, and whoever issued his business charter does. And if you take this to the county seat in the spring with a lawyer, there are people with the standing to enforce it." She looked up at him. "This is not nothing, Cole. This is why Gantry wants your land. He knows the water rights are worth 10 times what he offered you. He's counting on you not knowing the value of what you have." Cole was looking at the paper. His jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was angry. Not loudly angry, not the kind of anger that needed a room, but the cold, compressed anger of a man who does not waste energy on display and finds other uses for it. "You did this yourself," he said. "I didn't ask you to do this." "No, you didn't." "Why?" She looked up at him again. He was very close, standing behind and slightly to her left, near enough that she could have turned and been within arm's reach of him, which she was aware of in the way you are aware of things you are choosing not to act on. "Because it was there," she said, "and because you have been cheated consistently for 11 years by men who assumed you weren't paying attention, and I pay attention, and this is what I can do." He looked at her. The firelight moved across the side of his face. "Abigail," he said. "Don't," she said. "I was going to say thank you." "Oh." She looked back at the paper. "Then you're welcome." A silence that was not uncomfortable. Not any of the silences she'd known at the beginning, where the quiet had felt like pressure, like the held breath before something broke. This was a different kind, the kind that exists between people who have run out of the need to fill space with noise and have arrived at something more efficient. "I need to tell you something else," he said. She waited. He pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. This was unusual. Cole sat across from her at meals, but when they were working, he typically stayed at the workbench and she stayed at the table, and they occupied the same space without imposing on each other's concentration. Him sitting down now deliberately with the paper between them, this had the weight of intention. "3 days ago," he said, "when I was on the East Ridge, I found tracks." Her hands went still. "Not animal tracks?" she said. "No. 2 men, coming from the south, stopping about half a mile out from the cabin, then going back the same way they came." He held her gaze. "They weren't lost. Lost men don't double back on their own trail that clean." "They were looking at the cabin," she said. "They were counting windows," he said. "That's what the stop pattern looks like. You stop, you look, you mark what you see, you go back and report." Abigail felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cabin. She thought about the tracks in the snow, 2 men deliberate professional, and she thought about Birch and the 2 men Cole had seen in Harding Creek, whose names he didn't know. "You waited 3 days to tell me this," she said. "I wanted to be sure what I was seeing." "And now you're sure?" "Yes." She looked at the paper in front of her, the $4,000 that documented 11 years of systematic theft, and then at Cole's face, which was carrying something she recognized with a jolt of cold clarity. He was not afraid. He was concerned, which was different. He was the way a man looks when a problem he has been managing alone for a long time has become too large to manage alone, and he has decided finally deliberately to stop managing it alone. "What do you need me to do?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Nothing yet." "Cole, I mean it. Not yet." He leaned forward slightly. "I need you to know. That's why I'm telling you. Not because I need you to do something right now, but because you said you needed to know what you were walking into, and I should have told you sooner, and I'm telling you now." She absorbed this, the fire, the wind, the snow against the north wall, patient and relentless. "Is there a gun in this cabin?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up, went to the workbench, opened the bottom drawer, and came back with a revolver and a box of shells. He set them on the table in front of her. "You know how to use it," he said. She picked it up. It was heavier than she'd expected, cold from the drawer. She checked the cylinder the way her father had taught her, turning it carefully, counting. "My father believed in teaching his children things that were useful," she said. Cole looked at the way she handled the weapon, competent, careful, unsentimental, and something in his expression settled like a calculation that had just come out correctly. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She set the revolver on the table beside the paper that documented $4,000 in stolen wages, and she looked at both of them, and she understood with the clean, cold clarity of a December morning on a Dakota mountain that the life she had been trying to decide whether to choose had already, without her formal permission, chosen her. And somewhere underneath the fear, real and present, and not to be minimized, Something else was moving. Something that felt against all reason, like exactly where she was supposed to be. The revolver stayed on the table for 3 days. Not because either of them forgot it was there. Because leaving it out was a kind of agreement, an acknowledgement that the situation had moved into a different territory, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise by putting it away in a drawer and returning to the ordinary rhythms of the cabin as though the tracks in the snow hadn't happened. Cole watched her the way he watched weather. Not constantly, not obtrusively, but with the peripheral attention of someone cataloging conditions, checking wind direction, reading the light, noting what had shifted since the last observation. Abigail felt it and said nothing, because she understood by now that Cole Mercer's attention was not the controlling kind. It was the protective kind, which was different, and she had spent enough of her life not having it that she had no particular interest in pushing it away simply to prove she didn't need it. She needed it. That was a fact. She was 18 years old, and she had $3 in her boot and a revolver she knew how to use but had never actually fired at a human being. And there were men on this mountain who had been sent to count the windows of the cabin she was sleeping in. She was allowed to need it. What she was not allowed to do was let it change the work. She had built herself a life here out of labor and competence. And that was the foundation that everything else rested on. And if the foundation was fear, then the whole structure was compromised. So she worked. She maintained the accounts. She rationed the stores, with the precision of someone who understood that every calculation she got right was a kind of power the mountain hadn't given her, and gantry couldn't take. On the 4th day, Cole came in from the trap line at mid-morning instead of midday, which was the first signal. He didn't say anything immediately. He came in, hung his coat, and stood at the wash basin for a long moment, with his back to her, doing nothing with the water in it, just standing. "Cole," she said. "Dylan Reese came up the East Trail," he said. "He wasn't alone this time." Her hands went still on the ledger. "How many?" "2 men behind him, staying in the trees. They weren't trying to be invisible. They were trying to be visible enough that I'd notice them and understand the purpose of the visit without it having to be stated." "Intimidation," she said. "Yes." He turned from the basin. Reese had another letter. Same offer as before, different number. He said gantry had gone up 15% out of respect for my time. And I told him the same thing I told him before. What did the men in the trees do? Nothing. They watched. He came to the table and sat down. He folded his hands in front of him, and she watched him work through it, the same methodical process she'd seen him apply to every problem. Turning it over, looking at all the faces of it before deciding which one mattered most. Reese was uncomfortable, he said. More than last time. He's not a bad man. He's a young man working for someone who is, and he knows the difference, and doesn't know what to do about it. Could he be useful? Cole looked at her. If he's uncomfortable, she said, that means he has a conscience. A conscience is leverage, not the cruel kind, the honest kind. If there's a legal action to be taken against gantry, a witness who's conflicted is better than no witness at all. Cole was quiet for a moment. You're thinking ahead to the county seat. I'm always thinking ahead to the county seat. We have documentation, Cole. We have $4,000 in documented theft, and we have water rights that gantry is trying to acquire through intimidation, because he knows he can't take them any other way. A judge cares about paper. We have paper. She tapped the ledger. What we don't have is time to get there before gantry decides that the messenger approach isn't working. How long do you think we have? She turned the question back on him. You know this mountain, and you know this man. What does your instinct say? He looked at his hands. The snow starts breaking in late February, maybe early March if we get a warm stretch. He paused. Gantry won't want to move men up here in the cold if he can wait for easier ground. But if he thinks we're going to the county seat before he can get here... He stopped. Then waiting stops being his best option, she said. Yes. They looked at each other across the table. What did Reese say when you turned him down? She said. He said Mr. Gantry would be disappointed. What did he look like when he said it? Cole thought about this. like a man delivering a sentence he knew was wrong. Abigail picked up her pencil. "I need to write something," she said. "And I need you to tell me everything you know about the county clerk in Harding Creek. Who he is, who he answers to, whether he's Gantry's man or his own man." Cole pulled his chair around to her side of the table, something he had never done before, always taking the opposite seat, maintaining the distance of a man who understands that proximity is a kind of statement, and sat beside her and began to talk. She was aware of him next to her, the way you are aware of a fire when you've been cold. Not dangerously, just as a fact of warmth present and reliable. She kept writing. The letter took 2 hours and 3 drafts. When it was done, it was 4 pages, a precise, legally structured account of the water rights situation, the intimidation campaign, and the documented trading post fraud addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Yankton, with a copy addressed to the circuit judge, whose name Cole had mentioned once in passing, and she had filed away without knowing she would need it. Cole read both copies when she was done. He read them the way he read everything, slowly, completely turning each page with deliberate care. When he finished, he set them down and looked at her and said nothing for a moment. "You wrote this like a lawyer," he said. "My father corresponded with a lawyer in Lincoln for 15 years over a property boundary dispute. I typed his letters." She capped the ink. "I know what the language has to sound like. A judge reads the same 50 words in most petitions and ignores the rest. You have to put the substance inside the words he's already looking for." "Where did you learn that?" "Same place I learned everything. Watching someone who knew how do it and paying attention." Cole was looking at her with the expression she had seen a handful of times now, the one she still couldn't fully name. It was not admiration exactly, though there was that in it. It was something slower and more fundamental than admiration. The look of a man who has built his entire life around the assumption that he is alone in it and is confronting in real time the evidence that he was wrong. "We need someone to take this to Harding Creek," she said before he could say whatever he was about to say. "I can go." "You can't go. If Gantry has men watching the trail, and he does, Cole, those 2 in the trees were not the whole operation, then you leaving the mountain means the cabin is undefended and you're on open ground." She looked at him steadily. "Is there anyone who comes up here? Anyone who owes you, or simply someone you trust?" he thought. "Mick Garrity," he said finally. "He runs the line cabin about 4 miles west. Trapper like me. We've traded supplies in bad years. He goes to Harding Creek every 3 weeks regular." "When is he due?" "He came through," Cole counted. 10 days ago, so another 10 days roughly." "Is he reliable?" "He's honest," Cole said. "Which is different from reliable, but in this case they amount to the same thing." "All right." She folded the letters, both copies, and held them. 10 days. We wait for Garrity, we get the letters out, and we don't do anything that gives Gantry a reason to accelerate. And if Gantry doesn't wait 10 days, she looked at the revolver on the table. "Then we don't wait either," she said. The next morning, everything changed. Not because of Gantry, and not because of any of the things they'd been watching for. Because of Harold. She heard the horse before Cole did. She was closer to the window, and she'd developed over the weeks an ear for the specific sounds of the trail. And she went to look before she had time to think about whether it was wise to stand at a window with the situation being what it was. And she saw him coming up the trail on a horse that was too good for him, moving too fast for the conditions. And her stomach dropped before her mind caught up with what her eyes were seeing. Harold Pruitt, her uncle, looking like a man who was being chased by something he hadn't outrun yet. "Cole," she said. He was at the window beside her in 4 steps. Harold pulled the horse up short of the cabin porch and looked up at the window and found her face in it, and whatever he saw there, she had no idea what she looked like, and didn't care, made him close his eyes for a moment. Cole went to the door. He opened it and stood in the frame. "Pruitt," he said. Harold got off the horse. He was thinner than she remembered, which had only been 2 months, but a bad 2 months could do a great deal to a thin man's margin. He held his hat in his hands, the way men hold hats when they know they are not welcome, and are asking anyway. "I need to speak to Abigail," he said. No, Cole said. Cole. She came to stand beside him in the door. Not behind him, beside him. She felt him register the distinction, a small shift in his posture, giving her the space. What do you want, Harold? Harold looked at her. He had the face of a man who has practiced an explanation many times and knows it is not good enough and is going to deliver it anyway because there is no better option. I came to warn you, he said. About Gantry, she said. His expression shifted. You already know. We know considerably more than Gantry probably expects us to know. What's your piece of it? Harold turned his hat in his hands. The debt, he said. The men I owed money to in Harding Creek. Gantry owns the note. He bought it from them 2 years ago before I even came to Dakota. He's been buying up debt in this county for years, anyone who might have a claim or a connection to land he wants. He paused. He bought my debt because he knew my sister had married a man who settled near here before he died, and he thought there might be a family claim to her homestead. There isn't, Abigail said. My mother's homestead went to creditors when my father died. I know that now. Gantry found it out too eventually, but by then he'd already... Harold stopped, the hat turning slowed. The arrangement at the Black Dog. That was his suggestion. He told the men I owed that they could settle my debt by getting me to deliver you to Mercer's cabin. The silence that followed was the particular silence of something that has just reordered everything around itself. Cole went very still beside her. Abigail heard her own breathing. She counted silently the way she'd counted Cole's breath after he'd said something hard and got to 4. Gantry arranged for me to come here, she said. He knew Mercer would pay to get you out of the saloon, Harold said. He's been watching Mercer for 3 years. He knows how Mercer operates. He knew if there was a woman in trouble in front of him, he'd... Harold stopped, looked at Cole, looked away. He wanted someone in the cabin, someone he could use, someone whose presence here could be made complicated, legally or otherwise. He thought I would be leverage, Abigail said. Yes. He was going to use me to pressure Cole into selling. That was the plan as I understood it. Harold's voice was miserable. I didn't know all of it. I didn't know I thought it was just about getting my debt cleared. They told me find a way to get Mercer to take you in, and the debt was gone and we'd both be free. And were you free? She said. After the Black Dog, were you free? Harold said nothing. No, she said. Because that is not how Gantry operates. He doesn't release leverage. He accumulates it. She looked at her uncle, this man who had raised her, who had taught her to fold a letter and shell a pea and say her prayers, and who had sold her in a saloon for the cancellation of a debt that was probably never going to be canceled regardless, and she felt something in her chest that was not forgiveness and not hatred, but something in the cold territory between them where the truth lives when you're done with illusions. Why are you telling me this now? She said. Because Gantry sent Birch, Harold said. 3 days ago. He's coming up the mountain with 2 other men, and he's not bringing a letter this time. He finally looked at her directly. He knows about the letters you wrote. Someone in Harding Creek told him. He knows you've been building a case and he's coming to end the situation before it gets to Yankton. Cole moved first. He stepped back from the door, not away from the situation, but into it, the movement of a man who has just received the piece of information he needed to stop calculating and start acting. He went to the workbench without a word and began pulling things from the cabinet below it. Rifle shells, a second revolver she hadn't known was there, moving with the economy of someone who has rehearsed this moment without knowing he was rehearsing it. Harold stood on the porch, hat in hands, watching. Come inside, Cole said without turning. Both of you, get off the porch. Harold came inside. Cole closed the door and put the bar across it. Abigail picked up the revolver from the table. Her hands were steady. She was aware that they were steady and noted it the way you note something you expected to have to manage and are surprised to find already managed. How far out is Birch? Cole said. A day, maybe? Harold said. I came fast when I heard. I don't know the exact timing. 3 men, Cole said. He wasn't asking. He was counting. Birch and 2 others. Do you know if they're just coming to scare or coming to finish? Harold's face answered that before his mouth did. Finish, Cole said. I'm sorry, Harold said. I know you are. Cole said it without particular warmth, but also without cruelty, the way he said most things accurately without theater. He looked at Abigail. The letters. Already sealed, she said. Both copies. I'll give them to you now. Not me, Garrity. He turned to Harold. Can you ride 4 miles west in this snow? Harold blinked. Yes. There's a line cabin. Man named Mick Garrity. Tell him Cole Mercer says to take the letters in his coat pocket to Harding Creek today. Not tomorrow. Today. He looked at Abigail. She went to the shelf and took down the letters and brought them to Harold and put them in his hands. Harold looked at them. What happens after I do this? You don't come back, Cole said. Harold looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. There was everything she had not said and would not say in that look every year. Of care he had given her genuinely, before he had given her away. Every meal, every lesson, every winter. He had made survivable, and the $50, and the black dog, and Gantry's name written in the register of Harold's cowardice forever. She put all of it in the look. She did not look away. Harold put the letters in his coat. I am sorry, he said again to her specifically. I am sorry, Abby. That's the whole truth of it. I know, she said. And then because she was her father's daughter, and her father had believed in the grace of accuracy, go. Harold went. They listened to his horse move away down the western trail, and then the sound was gone, and the cabin was quiet, and Cole came to stand at the table across from her with the rifle in his hands, and looked at her with an expression that had no calculation in it at all. You knew, he said. When Garrity's name didn't surprise you, you'd already figured out that someone arranged for you to be here. She held his gaze. I suspected it. There were too many pieces that fit too neatly. Men who owe money don't accidentally stumble into a saloon on the same night as the one man in the county likely to pay their debt and take the woman home. Why didn't you say anything? Because suspecting and knowing are different things, and I didn't want to say something I couldn't document. She paused. And because I didn't know yet what it meant. If Gantry arranged for me to be here, then everything that happened after was... She stopped. Was what? She looked at him steadily. I didn't know if any of it was real. The fire, the chair, the way he'd built her space instead of claiming it, the price guide. Clara. The word we that had entered the cabin one evening and never entirely left. Cole set the rifle down on the table. He looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was simply his nature, no performance, no management, just the unmediated fact of what he was thinking delivered in the only way he knew how to deliver it. Every bit of it was real, he said. I didn't know who arranged what. I paid $50 because there was a woman in trouble, and I had $50, and I needed someone with a head for numbers. Everything after that. He paused. Everything after that was not a plan. Abigail, it was not a plan. She believed him. Not because she needed to, not because it would have been easier not to, but because she had spent 3 months watching Cole Mercer say exactly what he meant and stop when he'd said it, and this was no different from every other time, and she had learned to trust that. All right, she said. All right, I believe you. She picked up the revolver. And we have approximately 1 day before Birch gets here, so I suggest we stop talking about what was real and start talking about what we're going to do. Cole looked at her, this girl who had been sold for $50 in December and had built him an accounting system and found $4,000 in stolen wages and written 2 letters to a territorial judge and was now standing in his cabin with a revolver in her hand, discussing tactical response to a professional threat with the same calm she brought to columnar addition. And something shifted in his expression that she had not seen before. Not the careful, controlled look, not the unreadable one. Something open. Something that had been behind all the others underneath them and was now simply present. The root cellar, he said. If it comes to it, if I say go, you take the papers and you go to the root cellar. There's a secondary door on the east wall that opens into the tree line. You take the mare and you ride for Garrity's cabin, and you don't come back until it's over." "I'm not leaving you," she said. "Abigail." "Cole." She looked at him with the same directness he had always given her, returning it in full. "I am not leaving you. I understand the plan if the worst happens, and I will follow it if it comes to that. But I am not going to decide now, before anything has happened, that I will not be here." She paused. "This is my home. You said the decision was mine. I am making it." The word home sat in the room between them, solid and irrevocable. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. He showed her where to position herself if it came to gunfire, the angle from the east window that covered the trail approach, without exposing her to direct fire from the tree line. He showed her how to reload the revolver faster than she'd been doing it, walking her through the motion until her hands knew it without thinking. He did all of this with the same deliberateness he brought to teaching her the trapline, the same patient competence, and she absorbed it with the same attention she brought to everything. And neither of them said what was underneath all of it. That night, they did not sleep, not separately, not on opposite sides of the curtain in the arrangement that had held for 3 months. Cole stayed at the table with the rifle, and Abigail sat in the chair by the fire with the revolver, and they were awake together in the dark. And sometimes one of them said something, and the other answered, and sometimes neither of them spoke, and the silence was not absence, but presence. The specific presence of two people who have decided without ceremony to occupy the same side of whatever is coming. Around 3 in the morning, Abigail said, "Tell me something about Clara." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She used to sing when she was working, not loud, just under her breath, always the same 3 songs over and over, and she never knew she was doing it. She'd deny it every time." Abigail smiled in the dark. "She would have been furious about the trading post," Cole said. "She'd have ridden down there herself." "I'll ride down there myself," Abigail said. "In the spring, when we have the judge's ruling in hand, I'll ride down there myself and show Harlan the accounting." "We'll ride down," Cole said. "We'll ride down," she agreed. They went quiet again. The fire burned low, and she got up and fed it without being asked. And coming back, she passed close to the table, and his hand came up and caught hers. Not grabbing, just stopping a contact so brief and so complete that she stood still for a single heartbeat and felt the whole weight of 3 months in it. Then she went back to the chair. Birch came at dawn. Not from the trail, that was the first thing. The thing that told Cole everything he needed to know about what kind of man they were dealing with. Birch came from the tree line on the north side, which meant he'd been up the mountain before, and he knew the cabin's angles, and the 2 men with him came from the east and the west, respectively, spread out in the particular formation of people who have thought about this approach and decided they would rather have it over quickly. Cole was at the door before they reached the porch. He opened it and stood in the frame. Birch was not what she'd expected. She had expected something larger, louder. He was medium height and neat, with a coat that was too clean for the conditions, and the particular stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is more frightening than movement. He stopped 15 feet from the door and looked at Cole, the way professionals look at problems, not with hatred, just with assessment. "Mercer," he said. "Birch," Cole said. "You know why I'm here." "I know what Gantry thinks he sent you for," Cole said. "I'm not sure it's the same thing." Birch tilted his head slightly. "How do you figure? Gantry thinks there's still something here he can take. He's wrong." Cole said it without heat, just the flat delivery of a fact. "The letters went out yesterday. 2 copies, different recipients. Territorial Land Office and the Circuit Judge in Cheyenne. Documented water rights. Documented fraud at the trading post. Documented intimidation campaign." He paused. "You ride back and tell Gantry that the only thing that gets worse for him now is if something happens to anyone on this mountain." Birch was quiet for a moment. The man on the east side shifted. Abigail watched him through the gap in the window frame, where she had positioned herself, tracking the movement, holding the revolver with both hands the way Cole had shown her. "Gantry won't like that answer," Birch said. "No," Cole said. "He won't. My job is to bring him a better one. Your job," Cole said, "is what you make it. You're a professional man, Birch. You understand the arithmetic. 3 of you on an open approach against a cabin winter conditions documentation already in Yankton. This is not favorable arithmetic, and you know it. Gantry is asking you to make his problem worse, so he doesn't have to own it himself. Birch looked at Cole for a long moment. Then he looked at this cabin at the window where Abigail was positioned, and she understood that he could see the angle she was covering, and she understood that he had the experience to recognize what that angle meant and what it told him about what was inside the cabin. He looked back at Cole. "You've got someone in there," he said. "Who knows what they're doing?" "Yes," Cole said. "I do." Birch stood very still for a moment. He looked at the East man, the West man. He ran the arithmetic, and she watched him run it, and she watched him come out the other side of it. He turned to the East man. "Ride back," he said. The East man blinked. "Birch." "Ride back," he said again. Same tone. "No argument welcome." He looked at the West man, and the West man reading the room turned his horse without a word. Birch looked at Cole. "Gantry won't let this go with letters," he said. "You understand that?" "I do," Cole said. "But Gantry answering to a territorial judge is a different problem than Gantry answering to me. He can bluster through the second one." He paused. "Not the first." Birch looked at him for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the tree line. Cole stood in the door until the sounds of 3 horses had diminished to nothing. Then he came inside and closed the door and set the bar across it and turned around, and Abigail was there 2 feet away, revolver at her side, having come from the window without knowing exactly when she'd moved, and they stood in the quiet of the cabin with the fire behind her and the morning coming through the window and the particular absolute quiet of something that has just passed and left the air clean. "It's not over," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. The judge will take time." "Yes." "And Gantry will try something else." "Most likely." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light moved across the left side of his face, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her by how unsurprising it felt that she had memorized this face, not deliberately, not as a project, but the way you memorize the things you look at every day until they become part of your own sense of what the world looks like. "We'll handle it," she said. Cole Mercer looked at Abigail Carter in the morning light of a cabin that was not his alone anymore, and would not be again, and he said, "Yes, we will." The silence after Birch rode away lasted exactly 4 days. Not peaceful silence. Not the silence of a mountain in winter doing what mountains do, indifferent to the small dramas of the people living on it. This was the silence of a held breath, the specific quiet of 2 people who have just survived something, and know with the bone-deep certainty that experience teaches that surviving the first thing does not mean the second thing isn't coming. Abigail knew it. Cole knew it. They moved through those 4 days with the careful efficiency of people who understand that the work still needs doing, regardless of what is coming, and that doing the work is itself a form of readiness. She finished the second copy of the accounting records, a full duplicate of everything she had built over 3 months, organized so that a stranger could follow it without explanation. She sealed it in oilcloth and put it in the root cellar behind the dried apples in the particular corner that stayed driest through the spring thaw. Cole watched her do this without comment, and then went and added a second rifle to the same location, wrapped in the same oilcloth logic, and neither of them spoke about what they were preparing for, because the preparation was its own conversation. On the second day, Mick Garrity came back. He arrived at mid-morning from the Western Trail on foot because his horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles out, and he came in stamping snow off his boots with the particular bad-tempered energy of a man who has had a hard morning and has news that is going to make it worse. "Delivered your letters," he said, before he'd fully closed the door. He was a compact man, Garrity somewhere past 50, with a face like weathered bark and eyes that missed very little. He'd met Abigail once before briefly, and had looked at her the way a sensible person looks at a development they haven't fully assessed yet, reserving judgment, gathering information. Territorial Office took the land rights letter without comment. The judge's clerk. He stopped. "What?" Cole said. The clerk said the judge is already in Dakota territory, circuit business. He's in Harding Creek until the end of the week. Garrity looked at Cole steadily. He read your letter while I was standing there. The room went very quiet. The judge read it himself, Abigail said. His clerk brought it to him, and he came out and read it in the front office and asked me 3 questions. Garrity looked at her. He asked who wrote it. I said I didn't know. He said whoever wrote it was either a lawyer or had learned from one, and he wanted to know if Cole Mercer was prepared to testify to the documented fraud. He paused. I said I reckoned he was. I hope that was the right answer. It was the right answer, Cole said. Garrity looked between them. There's more. Say it, Cole said. Gantry was in Harding Creek when I delivered the letters. Not himself, his man Birch. Birch was at the trading post when I came in, and he saw me, and I'd like to think he didn't know what I was carrying, but I'm not a man who bets on things he'd like to think. Garrity sat down heavily in the chair by the fire. He left Harding Creek heading north within the hour of my arriving. I rode back as fast as I could, which wasn't fast enough because of the shoe. Cole looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. How far behind you? Cole said to Garrity. 2 hours, maybe less. Garrity looked at the rifle on the table. What do you need me to do? What happened in the next hour was the most organized Abigail had ever seen Cole move, which was saying something, because she had spent 3 months watching a man who did not own an unnecessary motion. He sent Garrity to the lean-to with specific instructions for the horses, both saddled, both ready, the mare positioned for the east door of the root cellar. He pulled the furniture in the main room into new positions that she only partially understood, until he explained the angles, the table on its side against the south wall, created cover for the window approach, the workbench repositioned, gave a clear line to the door without exposing anyone standing behind it to fire from either window. He talked while he worked, not narrating, just giving her information in the order she needed it. If they come in numbers, the door is the bottleneck, he said, moving the workbench with the focused effort of a man who has thought about this room in exactly these terms before. 3 men can't come through a door at the same time, so the door matters more than the windows. And if they try both at once, she said, then we have a problem, and you go to the root cellar. I told you. I know what you told me. He looked at her directly. I am not asking you to leave before anything happens. I'm telling you that if it becomes a situation where both the door and a window are breached simultaneously, the arithmetic changes, and your going is the right tactical answer, not the coward one. He held her gaze. Can you hear the difference? She could hear the difference. Yes, she said. All right. He went back to the workbench. Garrity came back from the lean-to and reported the horses ready, and then took the position Cole gave him at the north window with the second rifle, and the particular stoic competence of a man who has been in bad situations before, and has simply decided that this is the situation he is in now, and it needs managing. Abigail took the east window. Cole took the door. They waited. They key. The waiting was the hardest part. Not because of fear exactly. She had fear she was not going to pretend she didn't. But fear was a manageable quantity when you had a position and a job, and a clear sense of what you were doing and why. The hard part was the silence, the way it stretched and thinned and made every sound from outside into a question that couldn't be answered until it was. Wind in the timber, the horses moving in the lean-to, the fire which Cole had banked low so it gave heat without too much light. She thought about the 4 months she had lived in this cabin. She thought about Johnny cakes made from nothing, and a root cellar full of things she hadn't known about, and a man who slept in a chair so she could have his bed. She thought about walking the trap line in December snow, and the way Cole had said, "You're reading the animal," with the tone of a man who has just discovered something that pleases him. She thought about Clara, who had wanted to come to this mountain and had been right, and whose absence had built itself into the architecture of the man she'd left behind. She thought about the word "we" and all the times it had entered the room between them, and neither of them had acknowledged it, and both of them had heard it. She was not afraid of dying exactly. She was afraid of this being interrupted before it became what it was becoming, and that was a different thing. Not fear of ending, but fear of incompletion, which is the fear of people who have found something worth finishing. Cole said quietly from the door, "East Trail." She looked. 3 horses, 4 men, not 3. Birch had brought someone new, someone she hadn't seen before, larger than the others, and positioned slightly behind, and to Birch's left in the particular way of a man who is used to being the last resort. They came at a walk, no pretense of casual approach, this time, no performance of the messenger role. This was Birch having run the arithmetic again, and come out the other side, with a different answer than he'd arrived at 4 days ago. Something had changed, she didn't know what yet. She found out when they stopped 20 yards out and Birch called, "Mercer, Judge wants to speak to you." Cole said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come again." "Judge Aldous Crane," Birch said. "He's in Harding Creek. He wants you to come down, today." Garrity made a sound from the north window. Not words, just the sound of a man recalibrating. "That's not how a judge works," Cole said. "A judge sends a summons. He doesn't send Gantry's man." "He doesn't know I ride for Gantry," Birch said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite what it had been before, a flatness that might have been shame, or might have been something more complicated. The sound of a man who is delivering a message he has decided somewhere in the last 4 days is the last one of this kind he is going to deliver. He asked the sheriff to send someone up, and the sheriff sent me because I'd already been up here and knew the trail. "The sheriff," Cole said. "Tom Reeves, he's straight," Garrity said from the north window, low enough that only Cole and Abigail heard it. "I'll vouch for Reeves." Cole looked at Abigail through the dim interior of the cabin. She looked back at him. She had the letter, the copy of the documentation, in her coat, where it had been since Garrity had arrived. She stepped away from the east window and came to stand beside Cole at the door. "Who's the 4th man?" she said to Cole, quiet. "Don't know him." She raised her voice to carry through the door. "Mr. Birch, the 4th man. Who is he?" A pause. "Name's Wells. He works for the judge, court officer." She looked at Cole. "A court officer is not Gantry's man," she said. "No," Cole said. "He isn't." If the judge sent a court officer, then the judge read the letter, and the letter did what it was supposed to do. She held Cole's gaze. "This is what we wanted. This is exactly what we wanted." Cole looked at the door, at the men beyond it, at her. "If I go down that mountain," he said quietly, "you stay here with Garrity." "If you go down that mountain," she said, "I go with you. I wrote the letters, Cole. The judge is going to have questions about the accounting, and the accounting is mine. You can't answer those questions." He looked at her for a long moment. "Garrity stays with the cabin," he said. "Garrity stays with the cabin," she agreed. Cole opened the door. Birch looked at the two of them standing in the frame together, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. The look of a man seeing a situation that has developed beyond the parameters he was originally given, and understanding that the parameters were always inadequate. "We're coming down," Cole said. "Both of us." Birch looked at Abigail. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Birch," she said. They rode down the mountain with Birch ahead, and the court officer Wells beside them, and the 2 other men behind, and the trail descended through timber that she had climbed. In December, terrified and furious, and $3 in her boot, and she rode it now in March, with the snow beginning its slow retreat from the south-facing slopes and the revolver at her hip, and 4 months of work in the inside pocket of her coat. Cole rode beside her close enough that their horses occasionally drifted toward each other on the narrow sections of the trail, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the saying nothing was full. Harding Creek looked different than it had in December. Everything did in March. The light was different, coming at a different angle with a different quality. Less the hammer of winter, and more the tentative reopening of a world that had briefly closed. The town was small in that light, smaller than she remembered, and she thought about the way terror inflates things, The way the black dog had seemed enormous and inescapable on the night she'd stood in it, and how she could see now from a distance that it was just a building. Wood and nails, nothing that owned her. Judge Aldous Crane was in the back room of the sheriff's office, which was the largest private room Harding Creek offered for official business that wasn't a saloon. He was older than she'd expected, and younger looking than the title suggested, 60 perhaps, with the compact, deliberate presence of a man who has presided over enough human catastrophe to have lost patience with unnecessary drama while retaining complete attention for necessary facts. He looked at Cole when they came in. Then he looked at Abigail. Then he picked up the letter from the desk in front of him. "Which of you wrote this?" he said. "I did," Abigail said. He looked at her steadily. "How old are you?" 18, Your Honor." "Where did you learn to structure a legal argument?" "My father corresponded with lawyers for 15 years. I typed his letters and I paid attention." The judge looked at the letter again, then at her. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly, just with the efficiency of a man who has limited time and significant use for it. She sat down. What followed was the most rigorous 2 hours of Abigail Carter's life, and she had lived through a rigorous several months. The judge asked questions about the accounting methodology, the sourcing of market price data, the legal basis for the water rights claim, and the documentation of the intimidation campaign. And she answered every question from memory and from the papers in her coat pocket. And when she didn't know something, she said she didn't know it, and told him where the information could be found and how to verify it. And she watched him listening to her with the attention of someone who is updating their assessment in real time. Cole answered questions about the trapline, the trading post transactions, the approaches from Gantry's men, and his refusal to sell. He answered in the way he answered everything directly, without embellishment, stopping when he'd said what was true. The judge listened to him with the same careful attention. Harlan from the trading post was brought in. He sat across from Abigail's accounting for 40 minutes and turned the color of old chalk and said very little that was useful and nothing that contradicted the numbers because the numbers were not contradictable. The judge sent him out. Then he sent Cole out. Then he looked at Abigail across the desk. "I want to ask you something that is not strictly relevant to the legal matter," he said. She waited. "The circumstances under which you came to be on that mountain," he said. "Are you there of your own choosing?" She held his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." "You understand that there are resources available to you, if the situation were otherwise?" "I understand that." She kept her voice even. "The situation is not otherwise. I am on that mountain because I chose to be. The accounting system, the letters, the documentation, all of it is work I chose to do. No one compelled it." The judge looked at her for a long moment. "The man who bought your contract from the men your uncle owed," he said. "Cole Mercer. He didn't buy a contract. There was no legal contract. He paid $50 to remove me from a coercive situation and offered me work in exchange for wages." She paused. "He kept every part of that offer, exactly as stated." The judge nodded slowly. He looked down at the papers. "Miss Carter, the accounting you've built here is one of the most complete documentation of commercial fraud I've seen come through this circuit. The water rights claim is solid. Gantry's behavior constitutes criminal intimidation under territorial statute." He set down the letter. "I'm issuing an injunction against any further approach to the Mercer property pending a full hearing, and I'm referring the trading post fraud to the territorial attorney." He paused. "You'll need to appear at the hearing. Both of you." "We'll appear," she said. "It may be a month out. The circuit returns to this county in April." "We'll be here in April," she said. He looked at her one more time. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the registered of something that had impressed him despite whatever prior assumptions he'd brought into the room. "You'll make a good lawyer, Miss Carter," he said, "if the territory ever comes to its senses about such things." She stood up. "Thank you, Your Honor." She walked out of the back room into the main office, and Cole was there leaning against the wall with his hat in his hands and the particular quality of stillness that was simply how he occupied space and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and she said, "Injunction, fraud referral, hearing in April." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is it done?" "The legal piece is started. It won't be fully done until April." She crossed the room to stand in front of him. "But Gantry can't move on the mountain without violating a judge's injunction, which changes his arithmetic significantly." "Yes," Cole said. "It does." They stood in the sheriff's office in Harding Creek on a March afternoon, and outside the window, the town moved through its ordinary business and through the far window. She could see the black dog from here. Just a building, just boards and nails. And she thought about December, and the woman she had been in that building, and the woman who was standing here now, and the distance between them was not time. It was not 4 months. It was something harder to measure and more permanent than either. Cole put his hat on. He looked at her. "Ready to go home," he said. The word landed the way it landed. Not like a transaction, not like an arrangement. Like a fact, plain and solid, and already true the way facts are before anyone announces them. She thought about everything she had prepared herself for in December. The cruelty, the force, the inevitable claiming of a woman who had been sold like property. She had catalogued the dangers and braced herself against them with every tool she had, and the tools had been useful, but not for the purpose she'd built them for. They'd been useful for the actual work. The accounting, the letters, the 2 hours in the judge's chambers. The self she'd defended so carefully had turned out to be the self that won the fight not against Cole, but alongside him, which was a fundamentally different engagement than anything she'd prepared for. She had walked into the Black Dog in December as a girl who had been given no say in her own life. She was standing in the Harding Creek Sheriff's Office in March as a woman who had just decided the legal fate of a land fraud scheme that a powerful man had spent 3 years constructing, and she had done it with a pencil and a ledger, and the refusal to let any column of numbers lie to her. "Ready," she said. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon light, and the trail was the same trail it had always been, and she rode it differently than she had in December, not because the trail had changed, but because she had in all the ways that matter, and none of the ways that don't. Cole rode beside her on the wide sections. They talked, which was something that had been true for a while now, and still carried the particular pleasure of things that are both recent and already feeling essential. He told her what the judge had asked him while she was in the room, which was mostly about the trapline and the water rights and the specific geography of the Ridgeback Creek access. She told him what the judge had said about her accounting, and Cole listened with the expression she'd seen a handful of times. The open one, the one that wasn't managing anything, and when she finished he said simply, "He's right. About the lawyer part. About all of it." She looked at the trail ahead. He said the territory would have to come to its senses first. "The territory will get there," Cole said. "Eventually." "You sound certain." "I've been watching the territory for 11 years. It moves slow, but it moves." She thought about that. About patience as a form of faith, not the passive kind, not the kind that waits with folded hands, but the active kind, the kind that keeps doing the work, while the larger thing changes at its own speed. They reached the cabin as the last light was leaving the western ridge, and Garrity was on the porch with the second rifle across his knees and a look on his face that shifted when he saw the two of them come out of the tree line together unhurried. "Well," he said. "Injunction," Cole said. "Hearing in April." Garrity looked at Abigail. "The accounting held," she said. Garrity made a sound that in a less restrained man would have been a whoop. As it was, it came out as a sharp exhale and a single hard nod. "I'll stay the night," he said. "Head back in the morning." "There's stew," Abigail said. "If you want it." "I want it," Garrity said. Inside the fire had burned low in their absence, and the cabin had the particular cold of a space that has been waiting. And Abigail built the fire back up the way she always did, not thinking about it. Just doing it because it was her fire in her cabin, and she knew how it worked. And Cole came in and hung his coat and went to the workbench, and Garrity settled in the chair by the window, and the cabin filled back up with the warmth and the sound of people occupying it. She made the stew from the venison and 2 of the remaining potatoes and the dried herbs she'd found in the root cellar in February and had been rationing since, and while it cooked. Cole came to stand beside her without purpose or announcement, just occupying the same space. And after a moment, his hand came to rest briefly on her shoulder. Not claiming not possessive, just present the lightest possible weight there, and then gone. And she didn't move away, and she didn't say anything, and neither did he. Garrity across the room was carefully looking out the window at nothing. They ate. Garrity told a story about a trapping winter 12 years ago that involved a bear and a broken snowshoe and 3 days in a tree, and Cole added 2 details that indicated he had heard this story before, and it had grown in the telling, and Garrity said the details were accurate and looked offended. And Abigail laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in longer than she could clearly remember. And the 2 men looked at her, and then at each other, and something passed between them that she understood was the tacit acknowledgement of a change that both of them had already registered. Garrity slept by the fire. Cole took the chair. The familiar arrangement, the one that had held since December, except that Abigail, coming out of the curtained room past midnight, found that the chair had been pulled closer to the curtain than it had ever been before, close enough that if she stood in the gap between curtain and wall, she was within arm's reach of where he sat. She stood in that gap for a moment. Cole was not asleep. She could tell by his breathing. "The hearing in April," she said quietly. "We'll need to prepare additional documentation. The judge will want the full 11-year accounting, not just the summary." "I know," he said. "That's another month of work." "I know. And after the hearing, there will be the Harlan matter, the fraud referral. That could take longer." "It could." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I'm not staying for the winter anymore. I'm staying because the work requires it." A pause. Then quietly, "Is that the only reason?" She stood in the gap between the curtain and the wall in the dark, with the dying fire behind him, and Garrity's even breathing from across the room, and she thought about all the careful language she had been using for 4 months. The reasonable language, the practical language, the language of a woman who had decided not to build a story on top of relief and mistake it for something else. She thought about December, about the woman who had slammed her hands on a bar and screamed her uncle's name and meant every word of it, who had walked out of a saloon beside a stranger and chosen deliberately not to walk off into the cold because she understood the arithmetic of survival better than pride. She had survived. She had done more than survive. She had built something real in this cabin, something documented, something that a territorial judge had read and acted on, something that no one could take from the record now. And underneath all of that, concurrent with all of that, she had built something else. Something she had been naming wrong on purpose, because naming it right felt like the kind of risk she had come here having already taken enough of. She was done naming it wrong. "No," she said. "It's not the only reason." Cole turned in the chair, just enough to look at her in the darkness, not all the way, not demanding, just turning toward her, the way a man turns when he has been waiting for something, and it has finally arrived, and he wants to be facing it. "Abigail," he said. "Don't say anything formal," she said. "Please, I've had enough of formal things. Just—" She stopped, started again. "Just tell me what you want, the way you tell me everything, directly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to stay. Not for the accounting and not for the hearing, and not because the cabin runs better with you in it, though. All of those things are true. I want you to stay because this mountain is quieter when you're not on it, and louder in all the right ways when you are. And because I have been alone for 8 years, and I did not know until 3 months ago that I had any interest in being otherwise." He paused. "That is the direct version." She stood in the gap in the curtain and looked at the man in the chair, the largest person she had ever seen, scarred and weathered and rebuilt from loss into something that had held its shape for 11 hard years. And she understood with the clean, undefended clarity of a woman who has learned to read what is actually in front of her rather than what she was told to expect, that she had been safe here since the first night. Not because the danger wasn't real, The danger had been very real. Birch and Gantry and the men in the trees had been real, and Harold's betrayal had been real, and the cold and the isolation and the vulnerability of a woman with $3 in her boot on a mountain in winter had been real. But Cole Mercer had been a different kind of real. Solid and consistent, and there every morning before she woke, building a fire, or checking the horses, or sitting in a chair he'd claimed so she could have a bed, and he had never once been something she needed to brace against. She had come to this mountain sold, and terrified, and furious. She was standing here now, 4 months later, with a judge's injunction in her coat pocket, and 11 years of a man's stolen wages documented in her handwriting, and the clear, settled knowledge that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. She stepped out of the gap in the curtain, and sat down on the edge of the workbench across from him, close enough that the space between them was different than it had been. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because of the accounting, not because of the hearing, not because I have nowhere else to go, because I could find somewhere else to go, and we both know it." She held his gaze. "I'm staying because you are the first person in my life who looked at what I could do and said that is worth more than I paid for it, and meant that as a statement about value and not about ownership." She paused. "And because I am not afraid here. I have not been afraid here in a very long time. And that—" She stopped. "That is not a small thing, Cole. That is not a small thing at all." Cole looked at her. Then he reached across the space between them and took her hand. The same brief contact as the night before, Birch came, but longer. This time, deliberate, his scarred hand around hers, with the careful strength of someone who knows exactly how much he is holding and intends not to damage it. "No," he said. "It isn't." They sat like that for a while in the dark, with Garrity breathing across the room and the fire behind them, and the mountain outside doing what mountains do, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying more completely. In the morning, Garrity left before sunrise, clapping Cole once on the shoulder and giving Abigail a look that managed to communicate both approval and the firm intention to have heard none of the previous night's conversation. Cole went to the trapline. Abigail sat at the table with the ledger open and the March light coming through the east window, and she pulled the accounting toward her and found her place in it and picked up her pencil. The work was not finished. The hearing in April would require 3 more weeks of preparation. The fraud referral against Harlan would generate its own documentation requirements. The water rights case would need to be built into a form the territorial court could act on definitively. There was more work ahead of her than behind her, and she was 19 years old, and she was on a mountain in Dakota Territory, and she had a legal mind and a ledger, and a man who had paid $50 for her freedom, and then given it back to her intact, every piece of it, and asked nothing in return that she hadn't freely offered. She heard Cole's boots on the porch at mid-morning. She heard the door open and close, the coat on the hook, the familiar sounds of the cabin filling up. He stopped behind her and looked at the ledger over her shoulder, the way he sometimes did, not checking her work, just looking the way you look at something that belongs to a world you trust. "Good morning," she said without looking up. "Morning," he said. She kept writing. He went to the workbench and began the day's work, and the fire did what fires do, and outside the mountain was exactly what it had always been, indifferent and enormous, and asking nothing from the people on it except the truth of what they were. Abigail Carter had come to this mountain with nothing and built something that a territorial judge had read and acted on, and she had found in the process of building it the one thing she had never thought to put in any ledger, because she had not known it was a quantity that could be measured. The place where she was not property. The place where she was not a transaction. The place where she was simply and completely and without condition herself. She had been sold for $50 in December. She was worth everything by March. And she had earned every bit of it with her own 2 hands.